Hi guys, and welcome to Anunnaki Sanctuary's channel. Tonight, we walk barefoot across cool river mud, where the air smells like reeds and wet clay, and the first lights of a city tremble on dark water. You're standing in ancient Sumer, where most historians agree some of the earliest true cities take shape, and where writing begins to appear in a form you can almost hear scratching across a tablet. But we are going to keep this sleep-friendly and honest. Some parts of tonight are widely accepted history, some parts are interpretation, and some parts are calm, cinematic. What if imagination? Because historians debate plenty of details down here in the floodplain. Also, small reality check. You probably will not survive this journey if your idea of hardship is when your phone charger is in the other room. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop your location and your local time in the comments, because I love seeing how far this midnight little caravan reaches. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step closer to the riverbank, and the mud gives under your weight with that gentle, sticky pull. Like the earth is trying to keep you from wandering off into history. The Tigris and Euphrates are not tidy, polite rivers. They sprawl and braid and wander, spilling into canals, marshes, and flooded flats. The evidence we do have points to people here learning to live with water that can feed you one season and erase you the next. You can feel how the whole landscape breathes. In the morning, the sun will turn everything gold and dusty. At night, it is ink and silhouettes and the low, steady chorus of frogs. Like the marsh itself is humming you toward sleep. You move inland, away from the reeds, and the ground firms up into packed earth. Ahead, you see it. Not a single house, not a scattered camp, but a clustered geometry of walls, lanes, and courtyards. Most historians agree that in southern Mesopotamia, what we call Sumer develops some of the earliest city life we can trace clearly in the archaeological record. City, in this context, means more than people living close together. It means administration, storage, craft specialization, religious institutions, and a steady stream of decisions that need to be remembered, not just in someone's head, because heads forget, they get tired, they mishear, they die. And cities, once they exist, have a strange hunger for continuity. You pass a low wall and enter a neighborhood that smells like smoke, barley, and something faintly sour. Maybe beer, maybe fermentation, maybe a jar that should have been cleaned yesterday. The houses are made of mudbrick, sun-dried and practical, built from the very soil beneath your feet. There is a calm logic to it. The land offers mud. You turn mud into brick, brick into walls, walls into rooms, rooms into a life. If you are imagining gleaming marble, sorry to disappoint you. This is the age of humble materials and very serious paperwork, which sounds boring until you realize paperwork is basically magic that holds society together. Also, yes, the magic is performed by people who have strong opinions about grain. A courtyard opens ahead, and you see a workshop. A potter's wheel is spinning, and the potter's hands move like they have been doing this for 1,000 years, even if in reality it is more like a lifetime of practice passed down. Nearby, someone shapes a small lump of clay into something flatter and smoother, like a palm-sized pancake that forgot its purpose. You lean in. This is where your sleep story gets interesting, because you are watching memory become physical. Archaeology suggests that early writing in this region begins as a counting, the kind of counting you do when you have surplus and storage. Grain comes in, grain goes out. Sheep, goats, jars of oil, baskets of dates, bundles of reeds. When a temple or palace or big household manages resources, it needs a way to track who brought what, who owes what is stored, what is promised. One interpretation is that writing is born less from poetry and more from the administrative panic of, where did the barley go? And you can almost hear someone in the background sighing. The ancient version of, I know I put it on the spreadsheet. At first, people used tokens and simple marks. Over time, the marks become more standardized, more abstract. You watch the person with the clay tablet pick up a reed stylus. The tip is cut into a wedge shape. When it presses into the soft clay, it leaves crisp little impressions, like tiny bird tracks. This is why we call it cuneiform. Wedge-shaped writing. The earliest forms are not yet the full system that later scribes master, but the direction is clear. The evidence we do have points to a gradual evolution from pictorial signs and accounting notations toward a flexible script that can record language. And here is where the mood shifts from documented ground to interpreted possibility, without falling into fantasy as fact. Because once a society can store information outside the human brain, it can store stories too. Laws, hymns, contracts, lists of kings, ritual instructions, complaints. Yes, complaints. Humans do not invent writing and then remain serene. You can already sense the first dramatic letter being dictated like, Dear Sir, your copper is terrible. If you have ever left a one-star review, you are participating in a tradition with very deep roots. You wander toward a larger complex, and it rises from the city like a dark shape against the stars. A temple precinct, not the towering ziggurat you might picture from later periods, but the seed of that idea. Most historians agree that temples are central institutions in Sumerian city life, tied to religion, economy, and social organization. A careful reading might suggest that the temple is also a kind of engine, pulling in labor, goods, and devotion, then redistributing them in a way that binds the city together. You step closer and feel the temperature change in the shadow of the walls. The air smells cooler here, less smoky, more like damp clay and incense. Inside, the movement is quiet and purposeful. People carry baskets. Someone checks seals on jars. A scribe sits cross-legged, tablet balanced on the knee, stylus tapping and pressing. Your eyes adjust, and you notice the little cylinder seals, tiny carved stones rolled across wet clay to leave an image, like an ancient signature. Archaeology suggests cylinder seals are used to mark ownership, authorize transactions, and identify individuals or institutions. You watch one roll, and an entire miniature scene appears. A figure standing, a creature, a star, a plant. It is art and identity and control, all at once. Now, you could stop here and just enjoy the mainstream story. Rivers, irrigation, cities, writing, temples, solid ground. But tonight's title is a little bolder, and Sumer itself invites that boldness through the way its later texts talk about beginnings. It is not that the evidence proves a civilization that preceded all others, because that would be too neat, and the past rarely gives you neat. It is that Sumerian tradition sometimes frames its own origins as if something older sits behind the curtain. The one interpretation is that when early Sumerians talk about foundations, they're expressing the reality of layered settlement. People move, marshland shifts, canals silt up and get dug again. Villages merge into towns. Towns become cities. Another interpretation, more poetic, is that the language of firstness is a cultural strategy. If you can claim you are first, you can claim authority. You can claim a special relationship with the gods. You can claim that your city is not just a place, but the place. And then there is the mistier side, the gentle imagination we keep separate from the solid ground. What if those first marks in clay are not only about barley and sheep, but also about preserving something that felt older than the city itself? What if the scribes, in their careful lines, are trying to pin down a memory that would otherwise float away like fog over the river? You drift through the city's edge lanes, and the sound changes. Less chatter, more wind. A dog barks once, then decides barking is too much effort and goes back to being a dog. You hear distant water again, the canals. The canals are arteries, and they are also promises. Irrigation agriculture depends on managing water, which means cooperation, planning, and sometimes conflict, because water is never just water in a crowded landscape. Most historians agree that irrigation plays a major role in the development of complex societies in southern Mesopotamia, though scholars continue to debate exactly how decisive it is compared with trade, social organization, and other factors. You step over a narrow channel, and you can smell the algae and silt, that earthy scent that makes you think of gardens even when you are surrounded by mudbrick. In a small open space, you see people measuring grain. There are standard weights, containers, and a rhythm to the work. Like the city has a heartbeat made of counting. This is another mainstream anchor. Early Mesopotamian societies developed systems of measurement, accounting, and institutional management that leave durable traces in the archaeological record. And again, an interpretation comes with it. A careful reading might suggest that the rise of these systems also reshapes how people think about value, obligation, and time. When you measure grain, you make it comparable. When you record debt, you make the future into something you can own. You watch a scribe press a few wedges. Pause, then press again. The gesture is calm, almost meditative. It is easy to imagine scribes as dusty bureaucrats. But in this world they are power. They are trained specialists. Writing is not yet for everyone. It is a tool of institutions. A quirky tidbit. And this one is nicely grounded. Some of the earliest school exercises we have from later periods show scribal training, including copying lists and signs. And sometimes a student's frustration peeks through the cracks of formality, even if the earliest Sumerian writing is not full of personal diaries. The tradition that grows from it certainly becomes human, with all the impatience and pride that implies. If you ever complained about homework, just picture a young trainee scribe staring at a tablet like, "I did not sign up to memorize 600 signs," and then remembering that yes, actually, they did. As you continue, you notice something else. The city feels both local and connected. You see shells that likely come from far away, stones that are not native to the flat floodplain, maybe lapis lazuli much later in the broader Mesopotamian world. But even early on, trade networks begin to matter because Sumer lacks many raw materials. Archaeology suggests long-distance exchange is important in Mesopotamia, bringing in stone, metal, timber, and luxury materials. One interpretation is that these networks do more than move goods. They move ideas. They move styles, they move stories, and that opens a door to the title's bigger whisper. If ideas move, then no civilization is born in a sealed jar. Most historians agree that Sumer emerges within a broader Near Eastern context of earlier farming communities and evolving social complexity. Sumer is early, remarkably early, but it is not a lightning bolt in a vacuum. Historians still argue whether Sumerian city life is best explained as a local development driven by irrigation and institutions, or as part of a wider tapestry of influences, migrations, and exchanges that are harder to see clearly in the mud and silt. So, what does it mean to say a civilization preceded all others, according to ancient Sumer? On the solid ground, it can mean this. Sumerian texts and traditions sometimes speak as if there was a beginning that mattered so much it needed a story bigger than everyday life. And on the interpreted ground, it might mean Sumer remembers earlier stages of settlement and social organization, compressing them into mythic language and in the imagined cinematic mist. It might mean that when you stand here at night and look at the river and the quiet workshops and the scribes pressing wedges into clay, you can feel the sensation of standing on layers, like pages in a book that got wet and stuck together. You pause at the edge of the temple precinct again, and the night air cools your skin. Somewhere, someone laughs softly, and the sound travels a long way in the stillness. You notice a small detail you might otherwise miss. A basket of reeds, cut and bundled. Reeds are humble, but they are everywhere. They become roofs, mats, boats, pens, fuel. They are the plant version of, "We can make this work." You take one reed in your hand. It is light, strong, and practical. The same reed, cut differently, becomes a stylus that makes writing possible. And that is a perfect symbol for Sumer. Ordinary materials, extraordinary consequences. Now, to keep our mystery balance without drifting into certainty, let's touch a popular rumor gently. A popular rumor claims that Sumerian texts hide knowledge of a lost pre-civilization, sometimes imagined as advanced, sometimes imagined as otherworldly. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it persists because the language of gods and beginnings is vivid, and because humans love the idea that history has a secret basement, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion. The more grounded question becomes, what kind of earlier experiences could have inspired Sumerians to speak about origins with such weight? Floods, migrations, the merging of communities, the shock of urban life, the sudden feeling that you are living in a new kind of world. You walk back toward the river, and you picture the city from above, not as a modern grid, but as a living organism. Courtyards, lanes, workshops, storerooms, canals, a place where the future is starting to be recorded, where names can outlast bodies, where promises can be enforced by marks in clay, where a king can be listed, a temple can be supplied, a worker can be paid. Most historians agree that the development of writing and urban institutions in Sumer changes the course of human history, because it enables a new scale of organization and memory. And what if, just for a moment, you let yourself drift into the calm? What if? What if the first scribes, as they press their wedges, feel like they are rescuing something from oblivion? Not aliens, not magic technology, just the fragile human need to keep track of who we are, where we came from, and why this city exists at all. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. The earliest layers are always thin, always patchy, always half buried under later rebuilding. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. You stop at the river's edge and listen. Water slides past, indifferent, patient. The fan in your room, if you have one on, becomes the same sound, a steady hush. You can almost imagine the reed boats rocking, the canals reflecting stars, the city behind you settling into sleep. And you realize the first section of this journey is not about declaring a single answer. It is about standing in the birthplace of recorded memory and noticing how quickly a practical tool becomes a doorway for myth. Because once you can write, you can claim beginnings. You can shape them. You can turn mud into story, and story into identity. And in the quiet, with the river breathing beside you, you understand why Sumer can feel like it precedes all others. Not necessarily because it truly stands alone at the start of everything, but because it is among the first to leave its voice behind in a form you can still almost hear. You drift toward a quieter corner of the city where the air tastes less like smoke and more like stored dust and cool clay. A low building sits half in shadow, half in moonlight, and inside it you find the kind of silence that belongs to record-keeping. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of focus. Like everyone agreed to keep their breathing polite, a scribe sits near a small oil lamp, and the flame flickers as if it is trying to read over the scribe's shoulder. Stacks of tablets rest in baskets, some fresh and pale, some older and darker, baked harder by time or fire. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian scribes loved lists, and the evidence we do have points to an entire culture of cataloging, organizing, and arranging the world into rows you can hold in your hands. Some lists are practical: animals, professions, cities, offerings. Some are a little more ambitious: dynasties, reign lengths, the order of the world. The tablet the scribe is working on now feels different. The marks are careful, ceremonial in their spacing. You cannot read them, not truly, but you can sense the purpose. This is about who ruled and in what sequence, and how time itself is supposed to behave when power is involved. In later tradition, a famous example of this kind of text is what scholars call a king list, a record that strings rulers together into a single chain. What's broadly accepted is that such lists blend different kinds of material, including rulers who likely existed and rulers who feel more like legendary anchors. The list is not simply a spreadsheet, though it definitely has spreadsheet energy. It is also a story about legitimacy, and a story about why anyone should listen to the person sitting on the fancy chair today. You lean closer, and you notice the scribe's posture: straight back, calm hands, the faintest expression of someone who knows the rules of a very specific game. You might assume this work is neutral, but a careful reading might suggest it is political in a quiet way. If a city can argue, our kings descend from the original line, then it can argue. Our city matters more. If a new dynasty can claim it inherits an ancient mandate, then the transition feels less like a takeover and more like destiny with better branding. You can almost hear the voices behind the tablet, not because the clay speaks, but because the idea is familiar. Human beings have always been tempted to edit the past into a shape that flatters the present. If you ever posted a photo where you looked mysteriously thoughtful even though you were just waiting for pizza, congratulations. You understand ancient propaganda. The scribe's stylus taps softly, and you see numbers appear. Some are modest, the kind you could imagine, a reign of a few years, a few decades. But then, in the legendary zone of the list, the numbers swell into something enormous. Hundreds of years, thousands, reigns that stretch longer than any human life you have ever witnessed, longer than any plausible biography in the ordinary sense. This is where the strange stretch of time begins. What's broadly accepted is that many ancient traditions around the world include exaggerated lifespans and reign lengths in their earliest layers. In Mesopotamia, one interpretation is that these enormous numbers are symbolic rather than literal. They might represent a way of saying, this era was far away, or this rule was foundational, or the world was different then. A more cautious explanation could be that the scribes are using a numerical style that expresses greatness, not biology. To put it gently, the tablet might be telling you about meaning, not about birthdays, and yet you can feel why the mystery sticks. Because the moment you see those immense rains, your mind wants to ask a question that is half childlike and half irresistible. What if it is not just symbolism? What if the story is pointing at something else? You hold that thought carefully. Like a small candle, some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Here, the evidence for literal millennia-long rains is thin, and the mainstream view leans strongly towards symbolism, ideology, or textual convention. Still, the numbers create a mood, a doorway that opens into the idea of a time before time, a civilization before the familiar pattern of human limits. The scribe pauses, then presses another cluster of wedges. The lamp's light makes the tablet's surface look like a night sky filled with tiny geometric stars. You imagine the list being recited aloud in a ceremonial setting, a voice proclaiming the sequence of rulers, each name a stepping stone, each number a drumbeat. The effect would be hypnotic. It would make the present ruler feel like the latest verse in a song that started at the beginning of the world. One interpretation is that the king list is less a straightforward history and more a blueprint for how history should be understood. Cities rise, cities fall. Kingship moves from place to place. The list imposes order on chaos, like braiding a wild river into a canal. Archaeology suggests that real political power in early Mesopotamia shifts over time between city-states, dynasties, and regions. The list turns those shifts into a single narrative line, the way a bedtime story turns a messy day into a tidy arc. Only this bedtime story is told to everyone, and the moral is, obey the king. You wander past a shelf where older tablets are stored, and you notice the labels, little marks that help the scribes find what they need. It reminds you of a library, but warmer, dustier, and more likely to have someone arguing about the correct number of sheep in a delivery. You picture a junior scribe being sent to fetch a tablet and coming back with the wrong one, then getting that slow, disappointed stare that says, "I'm not angry, I'm just disappointed," which is the universal language of authority across millennia. Now your attention returns to the early names. Some are familiar to scholars through other texts and archaeology. Some are shadowy. The list can include kings that appear in multiple sources, and sometimes it mentions cities we know were important. That is part of why these lists are taken seriously, but not swallowed whole. They contain real threads, but the tapestry is stylized. Historians still argue whether the king list should be read primarily as a political document designed to legitimize later dynasties, or whether it preserves older traditions that may reflect some genuine memory of deep chronology. That debate matters, because it shapes how you interpret the feeling of before all others. If you treat the earliest reigns as symbolic, the message is not that people literally lived for thousands of years. The message is that the earliest era is sacred, distant, almost mythic, and therefore powerful. If you treat the earliest reigns as a distorted echo of something older, then the list becomes a kind of fossil, preserving the shape of a memory, even if the details are warped. To be clear, this is debated, and we are not proving anything tonight. We're following clues. You step outside the record room for a breath of cooler air. The city is quieter now, and the canal water reflects the lamp glow from distant courtyards. Somewhere, a night bird calls once, like it is checking in, then decides you're fine and goes back to being mysterious. You look up, and the sky is crowded with stars. Ancient people watch this sky too, mapping seasons, planning festivals, and reading omens. Most historians agree that Mesopotamians developed sophisticated astronomical observations over time. even if that later system is not the same as what you see in the earliest city period. The impulse to connect sky order with human order is already present. You think about the king list again. The enormous numbers could be doing the same thing the sky does. They create scale. They make the present moment feel small and therefore part of something bigger. One interpretation is that the list is a bridge between human time and cosmic time, a way to say. Our kingship is not random. It is woven into the structure of reality. Now, for the 30% mystery, kept safely in the realm of possibility. A fringe idea proposes that those ancient, elongated reigns could hint at a lost era of civilization, perhaps before a major disruption, perhaps before floods and migrations reshaped everything. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence is not strong enough to treat it as a conclusion. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a certainty, it becomes a storytelling lens. It asks you to imagine a long, dim prelude to the city you are standing in. A prelude that Sumerian scribes compress into legendary kings and impossible numbers. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. The earliest layers of settlement are difficult to trace cleanly in a landscape where rivers move. Canals are dug and refilled, and mudbrick structures melt back into earth. Archaeology suggests deep layers exist beneath later cities, but finding and interpreting them is slow, careful work. That leaves room for imagination, and humans are very talented at filling in blank pages. You walk along a wall where someone has pressed a seal into wet clay to close a door latch. The impression is crisp, a figure, maybe a symbol, maybe an animal, authority made visible. You cannot help a small laugh at the idea that even in the Bronze Age, people are already inventing the ancient version of access control. You need the right stamp to get in. Somewhere, a guard is basically saying, "Sorry, no seal, no entry." With the same weary tone of someone checking wristbands at a concert, you pause near a small shrine at a crossroads, a little niche, a small offering bowl, a few grains scattered like someone tried to be generous, but also tried to stay on budget. The city's spiritual life is woven into its daily life. Most historians agree that religion in early Mesopotamian cities is not only personal belief, but also public institution, shaping labor, festivals, and political legitimacy. In that context, a list of kings is not just human history, it is part of the sacred order, a way to align rulers with the divine plan as people understand it. And yet, even sacred order can be a patchwork. A careful reading might suggest that the king list reflects competing local traditions stitched together. Different cities might keep their own memories. Later, scribes might harmonize them into one sequence. When you harmonize, you choose. When you choose, you leave things out. That is not necessarily deceit. It can be the natural result of wanting a coherent narrative. But it does mean the list is not a simple window. It is a crafted object. You return to the scribe's room, and you see a different tablet nearby. It has a practice grid, repeated signs, the scribal equivalent of handwriting drills. The signs are almost comically uniform, like the student is terrified of making them uneven. You imagine the teacher looming nearby, not with cruelty, but with the intense seriousness of someone guarding civilization, because in a way, they are. Writing is power. Writing is memory. Writing is the difference between I think and I know because it is recorded. Also, writing is the reason anyone can invoice you, which is a mixed blessing. But history is complicated like that. The scribe finishes a line, then gently rotates the tablet to continue. You notice how physical this knowledge is. It is not floating in a cloud. It is in clay. It can crack. It can be lost. It can also survive for millennia if it is baked and buried and forgotten. That is one of the strangest ironies of the ancient world. Destruction can preserve, fire can harden tablets, collapse can seal archives, disaster can become a time capsule. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Disasters are tragedies for people, but they sometimes leave evidence that later historians can study. That is a possibility, not a certainty in any single case. But it is a pattern scholars consider. You stand there with the smell of clay and lamp oil in your nose, and you feel the king list as a kind of dream the city tells itself. A dream of order, of continuity, of being chosen by time. What's broadly accepted is that Sumerian and later Mesopotamian traditions use such texts to express legitimacy and structure. One interpretation is that the earliest, impossible reigns are the dream's deep foundation, like the bedrock under a house. Even if you cannot walk on it in everyday life, you want to believe it is there. And in the soft cinematic mist, you allow one more what if, only as mood. What if the scribes are not only listing kings, but also encoding a feeling that the world used to be different? Not necessarily better, not necessarily more advanced, just different, like a landscape before the rivers changed course. What if the enormous numbers are a way of saying, there was a long time when everything was settling into place, and we do not fully remember how. You let the lamp's warm flicker slow your thoughts. The wedges on the tablet look like tiny footprints across a quiet field, in a city built of mud and reeds. The boldest structure might be the idea of recorded time itself. And as you listen to the faint scratch of stylus in clay, you understand the strange seduction of the claim that something came before. The list invites it, the numbers tease it. The silence around the records makes it feel possible. Still, the solid ground stays solid. The evidence we do have points to human societies building complexity over long periods, with Sumer standing among the earliest places where that complexity becomes sharply visible in cities and writing. The mist stays mist. A fringe idea can be interesting to contemplate, but it remains a theory, not a verdict. Tonight, you simply hold both in your hands, the clay of documented history, and the cool air of interpretation, and the gentle imagination that helps you drift, calm and curious. Deeper into the night, you walk into the part of the city where the ground feels deliberately leveled, tamped down by thousands of footsteps that all seem to agree on one thing. This area matters. The air changes here. Less of the everyday kitchen smoke. More of a clean, dry scent of sun-baked brick and swept courtyards. Even the night insects sound a little more respectful, as if they have read the posted rules and decided to comply. Ahead of you rises a massive platform, not yet a perfect mountain of steps in the way later generations will love, but already heavy with intention. Most historians agree that temples sit at the heart of Sumerian city life, and the evidence we do have points to these precincts functioning as religious centers, economic hubs, and social anchors all at once. People do not come here only to pray. They come to deliver goods, to receive rations, to work, to witness rituals, to seal agreements. If a city is a body, this place is the heartbeat and the pantry and the meeting room. All in one, you step across a threshold marked by a low wall. A guard watches you with that calm expression of someone who has seen every type of visitor, including the kind who just wants to look around and then immediately touches everything. You keep your hands politely at your sides. The courtyard is wide, and the moonlight paints the brickwork in soft silver. You can see repair patches, slightly different colored bricks where older ones crumbled and were replaced. Archaeology suggests these buildings are constantly maintained, rebuilt, expanded, and reshaped. Because mudbrick has a life cycle, it is strong enough to last, but humble enough to return to earth if you ignore it. Workers move quietly, carrying baskets of barley, bundles of reeds, jars sealed with clay stoppers. A scribe stands near a doorway and checks marks on a tablet, making sure offerings and deliveries match what is expected. The evidence we do have points to complex administrative practices in temple contexts, including accounting and standardized procedures. One interpretation is that the temple is not only a house of the gods, but also a technology of organization, a way to coordinate labor and resources on a scale that turns a town into a city. You glance toward the main structure. A staircase climbs to a higher level, and the steps look worn, not from careless feet, but from countless deliberate ascents. This is a place built to make you move upward, built to make your body understand hierarchy without anyone needing to say the word. Your knees learn the lesson, even if your brain is pretending it does not. The night breeze brushes your face as you climb, carrying the scent of river water and distant cooking fires. The city hum is softer up here, like you are floating above daily life. Most historians agree that the great step temples, often called ziggurats in later periods, become a defining feature of Mesopotamian sacred architecture. Archaeology suggests these monuments are built in stages, with layers of mud brick, sometimes faced with baked brick, and often integrated into larger temple complexes. In the earlier phases, the forms can be simpler, but the impulse is already there. Raise the sacred space above the ordinary ground, shape the skyline, make the gods feel close enough to matter, and far enough to be feared and respected. One interpretation is that height itself is a form of argument. A tall platform says, "This institution is stable." It says, "This city has surplus." It says, "We can organize hundreds of people to build something that does not immediately feed anyone, which means we are powerful enough to invest in symbol and ceremony." It is the ancient version of a corporate headquarters lobby, except with more incense and fewer motivational posters about synergy. Though, honestly, the temple staff probably has their own version of "please respect the workflow." At the top level, you reach a terrace. The view opens. You see the city laid out like a pattern of dark blocks and narrow lanes, canals glinting like threads. The river beyond looks calm, but you know it is never entirely tame. The evidence we do have points to irrigation and canal management being vital. And that kind of water management tends to shape political authority, because whoever controls the gates and channels can shape who eats and who waits. A careful reading might suggest that the temple precinct, by collecting goods and coordinating labor, also becomes a central node in that water-shaped economy. You pause near a corner where a small altar sits. It is simple, but the placement makes it feel important. A shallow bowl holds traces of oil. A few grains are scattered nearby. You can imagine the ritual actions that might happen here: pouring, offering, reciting. Most historians agree that Sumerian religion is deeply embedded in civic life, with gods tied to specific cities and institutions. One interpretation is that temples help turn a community into a coherent social unit by aligning people around shared ceremonies and shared obligations. And yet, as you stand in the moonlight, you feel the strange tension in the stones and bricks. These structures are heavy, but they are also made of mud, made of the same earth that floods and shifts. That contrast gives the temple its emotional power. It is an attempt to build permanence in a landscape that keeps changing the rules. A priest passes by, wearing a garment that catches the light softly. They do not look at you directly, but you feel the awareness of someone trained to move with purpose. You notice their hands, clean compared to the workers below, and you think about specialization. Archaeology suggests increasing social complexity includes specialized roles: priests, administrators, craft workers, laborers, and trained scribes. The evidence we do have points to a society where not everyone does the same tasks, and that division can increase productivity while also creating hierarchy. Now, here comes the careful part, because the temple is also where mystery loves to gather. When people see large sacred buildings, their minds naturally start asking questions that go beyond bricks. Who taught them to build like this? Why this shape? Why this alignment? Why these rituals? The mainstream answer is grounded. Building traditions evolve, influenced by local materials, practical needs, symbolic choices, and regional exchanges. The evidence we do have points to gradual development across centuries, with continuity and innovation mixed together. But you can also feel how the temple invites interpretation. One interpretation is that the stepped structure echoes a mountain in a flatland, a human-made peak that replaces what nature does not provide. Another interpretation is that the terraces provide a stage for ceremonies that need to be seen, with visibility reinforcing authority. And in the calm imagined mist, you allow a what if. What if the very idea of a raised sacred platform is a memory of something older than the city? A story of a high place that people once sought for safety or communion when the rivers rose or the horizon felt too wide. Historians still argue whether the earliest monumental building in Sumer is primarily driven by religious devotion, by economic administration, or by political competition between city-states. The truth might be a blend, because human motives are rarely tidy. A temple can be holy and practical and strategic at the same time, like a multi-tool that also asks for offerings. You walk along the terrace edge and find a section where bricks are stamped with markings. Not every brick, but enough to catch your attention. Archaeology suggests that in some periods, bricks and building elements can carry inscriptions, naming rulers or dedicators. It is a way to link a person, a dynasty, or an institution to the physical fabric of the sacred place. One interpretation is that stamping a name into a temple is an attempt to outlast the fragile human lifespan. You cannot live forever, but your brick can keep whispering your name long after you are gone. It is the ancient version of leaving your initials carved into a desk, only with a much bigger budget and fewer school administrators yelling at you. You descend a short flight of steps into an inner space, partially enclosed, where the sound of the city dims and the air feels still. A faint smell of resin hangs here. You see a row of jars, carefully arranged, sealed and labeled. A scribe checks a tablet and nods to a worker. The evidence we do have points to controlled storage and redistribution in temple contexts. And this is where the temple becomes less like a distant spiritual symbol and more like a living institution that keeps people fed. Rations of grain, oil, and beer can be issued to workers, especially in contexts where labor is organized around large projects. You watch a worker receive a portion to then step away. They look tired, but not surprised. This is routine. And suddenly the temple feels like a machine, but a human machine, powered by trust, obligation, and the belief that the gods want this system to continue. Most historians agree that religion and governance are intertwined in early Mesopotamia. One interpretation is that divine authority provides a framework that makes large-scale coordination possible, because if the system is sacred, it becomes harder to question. That does not mean everyone believes with the same intensity, but the ritual structure shapes behavior. Now, you come to a wall where a relief or painted scene might exist in later eras. Here, it is simpler, but you can still sense the impulse to decorate, to signify. You notice repeated motifs, animals, plants, star-like symbols. Archaeology suggests that symbolic imagery appears on seals and objects, and those symbols can carry layers of meaning tied to gods, cities, and social roles. A careful reading might suggest that these motifs help unify the city's identity, turning abstract ideas into everyday visuals. Here is a quirky tidbit to keep the night gentle. In temple and administrative contexts, the obsession with record-keeping can get so intense that you can imagine someone inventing the ancient version of a filing system, and then immediately complaining that nobody puts the tablets back where they belong. It was in basket 3, clearly labeled, and now it is in basket 2 for no reason. Some behaviors are timeless. Civilization changes, but annoyance stays loyal. You step back outside into the courtyard, and you see the larger shape of the platform again. Moonlight makes the edges sharp. You feel the weight of it, not just physically, but psychologically. A raised temple changes how you experience the city. You always see it. It is a constant reminder that there is a higher order. Whether you interpret that order as divine, institutional, or political. Now, let's keep the 30% mystery in its safe container. A popular rumor claims that Mesopotamian stepped temples were designed as literal landing places for gods who arrived from the sky. This idea is dramatic and modern in flavor, and it is not widely accepted by mainstream historians or archaeologists. The evidence is thin, and the more cautious explanation could be that the descent of gods language in myth expresses divine presence in poetic terms, rather than aircraft mechanics. Still, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a mood, the feeling of looking at a towering platform in a flat land and imagining that it is a meeting point between worlds. Another fringe idea proposes that the temple architecture preserves a memory of an earlier, lost architectural tradition, perhaps from communities that lived here before cities became cities. This theory isn't widely accepted, and it is hard to test because earlier structures are often buried, eroded, or rebuilt over. But archaeology suggests the landscape holds deep layers, and the mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. When you build on the same sacred spot for centuries, you create a stack of history that is both rich and frustrating, because the oldest layers are the hardest to reach. You walk to the edge of the precinct where the canal runs close. The water is dark. A reed boat is tied to a post, rocking gently. Reeds again, always reeds, practical and patient. The boat looks like it could carry offerings, building materials, or people on temple business. The evidence we do have points to waterways being vital for transport and communication. In a land where roads can be muddy and slow, canals are highways. One interpretation is that whoever controls the temple and its docks also controls movement, and movement is influence. You watch a group of workers carry bricks from the boat, stacking them neatly. Each brick is a simple block of dried mud, but together they become terraces, walls, stairways, and rooms where rituals happen. Most historians agree that monumental building requires organized labor and planning, and that such organization reflects social complexity. The temple, then, is not only a building, it is proof that people can coordinate across families and neighborhoods, that they can commit to a shared project that outlasts individual moods and individual lives. This is where the phrase "preceded all others" can feel emotionally true, even if the literal claim is slippery. When you stand in a place where writing and administration and monumental building gather together, it feels like a starting line. You can see why later cultures look back and feel a sense of origin. But a careful reading might suggest that origins are not single points. They are long gradients, with many communities contributing, many experiments trying and failing and trying again. You step into a shadowed corner of the courtyard and let your breathing slow. The temple's walls hold the day's heat and release it gently into the night air like a warm stone under a blanket. Somewhere, a low chant begins. Not loud, not demanding, just steady. The sound blends with the water and the distant city noises, and it creates a soft rhythm that is easy to sink into. And in the calm, imagined mist, you allow one last what if, only as a bedtime candle, not as a claim. What if the first builders, the ones who laid the earliest bricks, were following a story they inherited? A story about reaching upward, about making a place where heaven and earth feel close enough to touch. Not because they had secret machines, not because they had hidden blueprints from Atlantis, but because humans carry patterns. Humans remember floods. Humans remember hills. Humans remember the comfort of a high place in a wet land. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. And here it is thin. But the feeling is real, and feelings are often the seeds from which myths grow. You turn away from the platform and look back one more time. The temple stands in the moonlight, quiet and immense, built from earth and intention. The evidence we do have points to human ingenuity shaping this place, with faith, administration, and power braided together. One interpretation is that the temple is the city's way of telling itself. We are not temporary, and in the soft hush of night, you let that message settle over you like a blanket, warm and heavy, while the river keeps flowing. Patient as ever, you find yourself walking where the land turns softer again, where the city's straight lanes loosen into paths that feel older than planning. The air is damp with marsh breath, and the ground smells like reeds and river silt, as if the earth is still deciding whether it wants to be solid or water today. Ahead, low mounds rise like sleeping animals, their shapes gentle, worn down by time and wind. This is not the loud center of commerce. This is the kind of place that quietly insists it was here first. Most historians agree that Eridu is among the earliest major Sumerian sites, often described in tradition as a very ancient city with deep cultural weight. Archaeology suggests early settlement layers in southern Mesopotamia can stretch back very far, with communities gradually growing in size and complexity. You step up onto a mound, and you feel it under your feet. Compressed history, layer upon layer, like a book made of dirt. A small breeze slides over the reeds and carries a faint, salty smell from the marsh. Somewhere nearby, water birds mutter to each other in the dark, sounding like they are gossiping about you. You move carefully, because the ground can dip into hidden wet spots, and nobody wants to become an accidental offering to the mud. You pause, listening. The quiet here is different. It is not empty. It is waiting. You come upon a low, ancient-looking platform, the remains of a structure that has been rebuilt so many times that the oldest parts are swallowed by newer footprints. Archaeology suggests that some sacred places in Mesopotamia are rebuilt repeatedly across centuries, sometimes in roughly the same location, creating thick stacks of architecture. One interpretation is that rebuilding on the same spot is a way of anchoring identity, even as dynasties change and canals shift. The sacred center stays put, like a pin holding the map together. You step into what might once have been a courtyard. The moonlight makes broken brick lines appear like pale bones in the soil. But nothing feels gruesome. It feels calm, like ruins resting. You imagine people here in a much earlier time, carrying baskets, smoothing floors, laying bricks with hands that smell like wet clay. Most historians agree that early Mesopotamian communities rely on mudbrick architecture and adapt to a landscape shaped by rivers and irrigation. It is practical, yes, but it is also intimate. The city is literally built from the same ground that feeds it. Now the story part begins to glow. Because Eridu is wrapped in a special kind of origin language, what's broadly accepted is that ancient Mesopotamian texts sometimes treat certain cities as first or foundational in a mythic sense. And Eridu is one of the names that can appear in those contexts. A careful reading might suggest that when a tradition calls a city the first, it might be doing several things at once. It might be remembering genuine antiquity. It might be claiming prestige. It might be turning a long, gradual process of settlement into a single, powerful starting point. You walk along the mound's edge and look out over the marshland. The water reflects starlight in broken pieces. Reeds sway and whisper. You can see why a community would settle here. Water means fish, birds, reeds for building, fertile land nearby for crops if you can manage it. Archaeology suggests early southern Mesopotamian life includes a mix of agriculture, herding, and marsh resources, depending on local conditions and changing river patterns. The evidence we do have points to people being extremely good at making a living in a complicated environment. You spot a shallow depression that might have once been a canal or a drainage channel. The earth here keeps the memory of water, even when it is dry. One interpretation is that early communities form around the skill of shaping water, turning seasonal chaos into something you can plan around. Another interpretation is more social. When people have to coordinate irrigation and maintenance, they build habits of cooperation, leadership, and organized labor that make larger settlements possible. You continue forward until you reach a small cluster of stones and broken brick that looks like a boundary. It feels like a threshold, the kind that makes you lower your voice without realizing it. You step over it and imagine the place alive. A temple, perhaps small in the earliest phases, growing through rebuilds. Priests, workers, scribes, offerings of grain and fish, hymns rising into the heat. Most historians agree that temples are central institutions in Sumerian city life, shaping both religious practice and economic organization. Archaeology suggests that early temples can develop over time from simpler structures into larger complexes. In a place like Eridu, that long continuity can become part of its identity. The city becomes not just a settlement, but a story about settlement. Not just a temple, but a story about temples. Now you reach the part where the mystery is gentle, not loud, because Eridu is not only a mound. Eridu is a claim in some traditions. It is described as a first city, a place where kingship, civilization, or sacred order begins. That does not mean it literally predates all human communities. What's broadly accepted is that human societies develop in many regions over long periods, and first depends on how you define it. But a careful reading might suggest that Eridu's firstness is about a particular kind of life. Urban, institutional, recorded, ritually anchored. You crouch and pick up a small fragment of pottery from the surface. You do not keep it, you just hold it for a moment, feeling its rough edge and imagining the vessel it came from. Archaeology suggests pottery styles can help date layers and track cultural change. A shard like this is quiet evidence that people cooked here, stored food here, fed families here. It is the kind of object that makes the past feel ordinary, which is strangely comforting. Civilization is not only kings and temples, it is also dinner. Here is a quirky tidbit that stays grounded. In later Mesopotamian life, fish and fishing can be deeply woven into economy and symbolism, and the marsh environment near Eridu makes that feel natural. You imagine an ancient worker complaining that the fish are biting better for the neighbor than for them. And you realize jealousy is also an ancient technology. Humans invent canals, but they also invent petty rivalry, and it does not even require irrigation. You stand and look across the mound again. The wind cools your face. In the distance, you see a faint glow from a hearth or a lamp. The night here is not silent. It is layered with soft sounds. Water, reeds, distant voices, insects. It is a good place for myths to form, because it feels like a borderland between solid earth and the unknown. One interpretation is that first founding myths grow strongest in borderlands like this. The marsh is productive, but it is also unstable. It can swallow things. It can reveal things. A careful reading might suggest that when people live with that kind of uncertainty, they build stories that promise stability. Stories that say, this place was chosen. Stories that say, our order is not accidental. Stories that say, we belong here. Even if the river tries to argue, historians still argue whether Eridu's reputation as a foundational city reflects a clear historical priority in early urban development, or whether it is primarily a product of later religious and political storytelling that elevated certain places for symbolic reasons. You let that debate rest in your mind without forcing it to resolve. It is okay for it to remain a question. The evidence we do have points to real antiquity in the region. But mythic language is a different kind of evidence, one that reveals values and identity more than exact dates. You walk toward a slightly higher rise on the mound, and you notice something like an old shoreline line, a subtle curve in the terrain. It makes you imagine the landscape shifting across generations. Archaeology suggests river courses and marsh boundaries in Mesopotamia change over time, and that such changes affect settlement patterns. A more cautious explanation could be that when people say a city was founded by the waters, they are speaking both literally and poetically, because water is never just background here. It is partner, threat, and gift. Now the gentle imagination, carefully marked as imagination, slides in like a fog that stays low to the ground. What if the people of Eridu, looking out over this marsh, felt that they were not the first humans, but the first to make something permanent enough to matter? What if first city is less about being earliest in absolute time, and more about being earliest in memory, the first that could be named and held and repeated? You walk along what might once have been a processional path. It is not paved in a way that survives, but you can sense a route, a logic. You imagine festivals where people carry offerings, sing, and move together. Most historians agree that communal ritual helps bind societies, and temples provide a stage for that binding. One interpretation is that ritual is a form of social technology, coordinating emotion, cooperation, and identity. A small joke slips in as you picture an organizer trying to keep a procession orderly. You can practically hear someone saying, "Please walk in a single line," while everyone immediately forms 3 lines and a circle, because crowds have always been crowds. Civilization gives you rituals, but it does not automatically give you good line discipline. You reach a spot where the soil is slightly darker, as if ash or organic material once collected there. Archaeology suggests hearths, refuse pits, and activity areas can leave such traces. The mound is not just grand structures. It is daily life compacted and buried. You imagine someone baking flatbread, the smell warm and comforting, spreading into the night. You imagine children running, then being shushed because the temple area requires a certain seriousness, which children famously respect for about 12 seconds. Now, for the mystery portion that stays clearly in theory. A popular rumor claims that ancient Mesopotamian traditions preserve hints of a civilization before the known cities, a predecessor culture that taught key skills or left behind sacred knowledge. This rumor is compelling, but it is not supported strongly enough to treat as fact. The evidence is thin, and the more cautious explanation could be that predecessors in myth are often a way of talking about ancestry, migration, and cultural inheritance without keeping a literal historical record. Still, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the rumor becomes a lens. It encourages a question that is actually mainstream friendly. How much of early Sumerian culture is inherited from earlier communities whose names we may not know clearly? Archaeology suggests long development in the region, with earlier village cultures and evolving social complexity, even when the written record is not yet present. The mystery is not in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. The earliest communities leave fewer direct voices behind. They leave pottery, tools, house outlines, and sometimes very subtle changes in soil that you have to interpret with patience. You walk to the edge of the mound again, and you imagine the marsh at dawn, mist over water, birds rising, people pushing reed boats. The city, small at first, then larger. A temple rebuilt, a name repeated until it becomes heavy with meaning. Eridu. The syllables feel like a stone dropped into water, making ripples. One interpretation is that a city's first founding myth is like a seal rolled into clay. It leaves an impression that shapes how later generations see themselves. If later scribes and priests say Eridu is first, that statement becomes part of the structure of their world. It can influence political claims, religious pilgrimages, and the sense of where legitimacy lives. It can also soothe anxiety. In a shifting landscape, having a first place gives you a center. You notice a small stack of reeds near a hut at the marsh edge. A worker is weaving something, maybe a mat, maybe a basket. Reeds again, endlessly useful. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian societies use local materials with remarkable ingenuity, and reeds are central in marsh regions. You watch the weaving pattern emerge, tight and consistent. It is slow work, but it is steady. The rhythm is calming, like counting your breaths. A gentle thought arrives. Weaving is a perfect metaphor for this whole question. Civilization is not a single spark. It is strands woven over time. Some strands are visible and documented. Some strands are inferred by archaeology. Some strands are imagined, because humans cannot resist imagining. The key is to keep them sorted. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. You turn back toward the mound's center and picture the earliest builders deciding where to place a sacred structure. Perhaps they choose slightly higher ground. Perhaps they choose a spot tied to a spring, a channel, or a tradition. Archaeology suggests settlement choices often reflect water access, defensibility, and resource availability. One interpretation is that sacred choices can also be practical choices in disguise. A temple on higher ground is spiritually elevated and also less likely to be soggy. Sometimes the gods and good engineering happen to agree. You take a slow breath and let the night settle into your shoulders. The mound does not demand answers. It offers presence. It offers the feeling of deep time without shouting. The evidence we do have points to Eridu's significance in early Mesopotamian development and in later tradition, while interpretations vary about exactly why it becomes such a powerful symbol. And in the calm, what if, you allow a final image that stays clearly imaginary, a small group standing at this marsh edge long ago, looking over water that shimmers under moonlight, deciding to build something that will make the place remember them, and hoping, quietly, that the place will also remember what came before them. You walk into a night that feels unusually still, the kind of stillness that makes you notice every small sound. A drip from a reed roof, a distant splash, the soft suck of mud when you shift your weight. The air is heavier here, humid in a way that clings to your skin, and the horizon looks low and uncertain, as if the land itself is holding its breath. The ground under you is not the firm, packed earth of busy streets. It is a broad, flat stretch near a canal where the soil looks slightly different, darker, smoother, almost polished by water. You crouch and press your fingers into it. The texture is fine, silky, and it stains your skin. This is silt, the kind of material rivers leave behind when they overrun their banks. The evidence we do have points to major floods occurring in Mesopotamia at different times, sometimes affecting wide areas, sometimes hitting specific regions hard. Archaeology suggests that flood deposits can appear as distinct layers in certain sites. Though floods are not uniform, and the land does not preserve every event in the same way, you stand and look across the flatness. In the moonlight, it is easy to imagine water covering it all, stretching into the distance like a dark mirror. This landscape invites flood stories because it is built by floods. The rivers create the fertility that feeds the cities, and they also carry the threat that can sweep through homes, fields, and storerooms in a single night. Most historians agree that flood traditions in ancient Mesopotamia are important and widespread, appearing in different forms across texts and later retellings. What's broadly accepted is that these stories often carry moral, social, and cosmic themes, not just meteorological details. A more cautious explanation could be that when people speak of one great flood, they may be blending memories of many disasters into a single powerful narrative. Big floods happen, smaller floods happen. The worst ones get talked about for generations, and over time the story gathers weight until it feels like it happened to everyone at once. You walk along the canal edge and notice repair work. A section of embankment is reinforced with woven reed bundles, packed with mud. A worker checks it with a foot, testing firmness. You can tell this is not casual maintenance. This is survival planning. The evidence we do have points to extensive canal systems and water management in Mesopotamia, and those systems require constant labor. One interpretation is that the rhythm of flood and repair shapes the social rhythm too, creating seasons of anxiety and seasons of rebuilding. It is hard to feel fully safe when your farmland depends on rivers that have moods. A small group sits near a low fire, speaking quietly. Their faces glow orange for a moment, then fade back into shadow. You catch fragments of conversation, and you hear the tone shift when someone mentions a flood year. It is spoken like a scar, not shouted, but remembered with that serious pause people use when they are trying not to dramatize what still hurts. You sit at the edge of their circle, not intruding, just listening. One person draws a line in the dirt with a stick, then marks a higher line above it. Water levels. You realize. They point, then shake their head slowly. A careful reading might suggest that flood stories are not only myths, but also a way to transmit practical memory. How high did the water rise? Where did it break through? Which channels failed? Who lost what? Myths can carry warnings in a form that sticks. Historians still argue whether famous Mesopotamian flood narratives are primarily rooted in specific historical flood events at particular sites, or whether they should be seen mainly as symbolic stories that express the fragility of human order in a world shaped by unpredictable nature. You let that debate hang in the air like mist. It does not need to settle tonight. The point is that floods are real here, And stories about floods are real too, and the two interact in complicated ways. You stand again and walk toward a low area where the land dips slightly. The soil is cracked in places, and in the cracks you see dried salt crystals catching moonlight. This land is productive, but it can also turn bitter if water sits too long and evaporates, leaving salts behind. Archaeology suggests salinization becomes a problem in parts of southern Mesopotamia over time, affecting agriculture and requiring adaptation. One interpretation is that environmental pressures, including floods and soil changes, push societies to adjust crops, adjust canal management, and sometimes adjust political structures, because scarcity tends to rearrange power. Now, you feel the story's tidal tugging at you again. A flood is not only an event, it is a reset button. The kind that can make people say, everything changed. And if everything changed, it becomes tempting to imagine that there was a different world before. A world with a different rhythm, maybe even a world with a different kind of civilization. The evidence we do have points to continuous human habitation and development in the region. Not a clean break where one fully documented civilization ends and a completely different one begins. Still, a more cautious explanation could be that floods and shifts in river courses create gaps in the record. They can erase buildings, displace communities, and force resettlement. Those disruptions can make the past feel lost, even when it is not truly gone. It is just buried, mixed, and harder to read. You walk along a line where the ground changes color, a subtle boundary between darker silt and lighter soil. You imagine an archaeologist seeing something like this in a cut, interpreting it as a flood deposit. You imagine layers like pages. Some pages are clear, some pages are smeared, and some pages are missing because water does not care about your archive. Now, the 30% mystery enters, carefully labeled. A popular rumor claims that a catastrophic flood wiped out an advanced civilization that existed before the Sumerian cities, leaving only fragments of knowledge that later people inherited. This rumor is dramatic, and it is not widely accepted. The evidence is thin, and there is no solid basis to treat it as confirmed history. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the more grounded idea becomes simpler. Disasters can cause cultural loss, and survivors can carry memories and skills forward into new social forms. In that grounded version, a flood does not need to erase an advanced global empire. It only needs to destroy local settlements, break networks, scatter people, and force them to rebuild. When people rebuild, they reuse what they know. They also mythologize what they lost. The story becomes a container for grief, caution, and identity. You hear a sudden splash nearby, and you freeze for a second, then relax when you realize it is only a fish. Even the fish are dramatic here. Apparently, you watch ripples spread, and you think about how stories ripple too. You move toward a small storage area near the canal, where jars are stacked on a raised platform. A worker checks the seals and tightens a reed tie. They are trying to keep goods safe from moisture and pests. This is everyday resilience. The evidence we do have points to structured storage systems and rationing in early cities. And flood risk makes those systems even more crucial. One interpretation is that fear of loss encourages centralization. If you want to protect surplus, you build institutions that can guard it. You build walls. You build raised platforms. You build rules. You build records. Floods do not create civilization by themselves, but they can shape the pressures that make coordination feel necessary. You walk to a slightly higher ridge and look out again. In your mind, you let a cinematic what-if unfold, clearly framed as imagination. What if there was a night when the water rose fast, faster than the watchman expected? What if lamps were snuffed out one by one as homes filled? What if people fled to higher ground, carrying children and small bundles, leaving heavier possessions behind? Not a world-ending deluge, but a terrifying local catastrophe. And what if, after the water receded, the survivors looked at the silt layer coating everything and felt, deeply, that the world before had been washed away? That feeling could become a myth. It could become a story told to children so they respect the river. It could become a ritual reminder to maintain canals. It could become a cosmic narrative about order and chaos. Most historians agree that myth often encodes human experiences in symbolic language, and floods in Mesopotamia are a natural candidate for that process. You turn and notice a shrine built on a small rise, simple and sturdy. A few offerings sit there, a pinch of grain, a small cup. The placement makes sense. If water rises, this place might stay dry longer. One interpretation is that sacred sites sometimes double as practical refuges, not always intentionally. But because communities choose meaningful high ground, in a landscape where high ground is precious, symbolism and survival can overlap. You walk closer to the shrine and listen. The wind carries faint chanting from somewhere in the distance, low and steady. It makes you think of how communities process fear, not with constant panic, but with rhythm, with repetition, with shared words, with ceremonies that make the unpredictable feel nameable. A second quirky tidbit slips in, gentle and human. You imagine someone after a flood, staring at a collapsed wall and saying with total seriousness, "We should have built that higher," while their neighbor replies, "Yes, and we should also have predicted the future." With the ancient version of sarcasm, disaster hindsight is one of humanity's oldest sports. Now you walk along a canal gate, a simple mechanism of wood and earthworks. Even if the exact design shifts across time and place, the principle is clear. Control flow, protect fields, manage risk. The evidence we do have points to water management being a central feature of Mesopotamian life. Historians still argue whether centralized authority emerges mainly to coordinate such water systems, or whether authority emerges for other reasons and then takes over water management as one of its responsibilities. Either way, the relationship between water and power is tight. You take a slow breath and feel the damp air settle in your lungs. The night is cooler now. The fire circle behind you is quieter. Someone has stopped talking and simply watches the canal, as if listening for the sound of rising water. That posture tells you everything. People here do not treat floods as distant legends. They treat them as neighbors with unpredictable tempers. Now, to keep the mystery balanced and safe, consider another interpretive angle. One interpretation is that flood myths are not only about literal water, they're also about social floods, invasions, collapses, political upheavals. When a city falls, it can feel like the world drowned. When a dynasty ends, it can feel like the old order was washed away. A more cautious explanation could be that flood imagery becomes a flexible metaphor for any overwhelming change. If that is true, then the myth of a great flood might preserve a memory of disruption that is not strictly hydrological. And in the calm imagined mist, you let yourself picture survivors carrying something precious. Not gold, not a secret machine, but knowledge, a way to dig canals, a way to measure grain, a prayer, a set of rules, a handful of signs pressed into clay. That is the kind of inheritance that can survive catastrophe. You walk back toward firmer ground. Your feet leave shallow impressions in the damp soil. and you watch the water slowly fill them. The river does not care about footprints. It cares about gravity. It cares about slope. It cares about rain far upstream where you cannot see it. That indifference is part of what makes flood stories so powerful. They remind you that human order is brave, but not absolute. The evidence we do have points to people in ancient Mesopotamia responding to floods with engineering, ritual, and social organization, building systems that allow cities to endure in a risky landscape. One interpretation is that the idea of a prior world, a lost age, grows unnaturally in a place where nature can erase your work overnight. You rebuild, and you remember, and you tell stories that give the loss a shape. You stand on the ridge and look out one last time at the dark, shining water. It is calm tonight, but the possibility is always there, and that possibility, more than any single event, might be the true engine behind the flood stories that later scribes will preserve. Not proof of a vanished super-civilization, but a vivid reminder that civilization is always built on wet ground, and the ground can change its mind. You walk into a courtyard where the air smells of warm brick and faint incense, the kind of scent that clings to your hair like a polite reminder that the gods are listening. The city is awake in its own night way, not loud, but purposeful. A few lamps flicker behind doorways. Somewhere a donkey makes a soft complaint, like it is filing a formal grievance with the universe. You follow the sound of murmured prayer until you reach a small shrine tucked into a wall niche. Simple and well cared for. Most historians agree that Sumerian religion includes a complex pantheon, with major gods and many local divine figures tied to specific cities, temples, and functions. Archaeology suggests that religious practice is woven into daily administration and community life, not separated into a private corner. The evidence we do have points to offerings, ritual spaces, and a shared language of devotion that helps bind people together. A priest is present, not dramatic, not theatrical, just calm. They straighten a small bowl, adjust a bundle of reeds, and touch their forehead briefly as if marking a private rhythm. You stand back, respectful. You are not here to interrupt. You are here to observe how a city makes sense of itself. A careful reading might suggest that gods in Sumer are not only supernatural beings in stories, but also a way communities describe power, responsibility, and order. A god can represent a city's identity. A god can embody the forces that keep the canal flowing, the granary filled, the law enforced. Divine names become anchors for human institutions. And then you hear a name that catches your attention, one that has traveled very far into modern imagination. The Anunnaki. What's broadly accepted is that the term Anunnaki appears in Mesopotamian texts as a group of deities, often associated with divine assemblies or underworld contexts, depending on the period and the specific composition. The evidence we do have points to changing use and meaning over time, because ancient religion is not a frozen statue. It is a living language that shifts with politics, culture, and the needs of storytelling. You step closer to a larger temple courtyard where people gather in small groups. Some bring offerings, some bring questions, some bring that exhausted face that says, "I'm here because my mother told me to come," which is, honestly, a timeless expression. A scribe sits nearby with a tablet, recording something, and you realize religion here is not only belief, it is also a system. One interpretation is that the divine world mirrors the social world. There is hierarchy among gods, just as there is hierarchy among humans. There are roles and responsibilities. There are disputes. There are alliances. Myths can dramatize these relationships, but the structure feels familiar. A city understands power by describing it in the language of heaven. You walk along a wall where a relief might later show scenes of gods and worshippers. Here the surfaces are plainer, but you see symbols repeated on small objects and seals, stars, animals, stylized plants, figures standing with hands raised. Archaeology suggests that such symbols can signal divine associations, temple authority, or ritual contexts. A careful reading might suggest that imagery serves as a public shorthand, letting everyone recognize which god is being honored and which institution is in charge. It is branding, but sacred branding, which sounds nicer until you realize branding is always a little controlling. You notice a conversation between an older woman and a younger man. She speaks softly, but firmly, pointing toward the temple as if reminding him that gratitude is not optional. He nods with the expression of someone who will do the ritual now and complain later in private. Your first small joke of the night slides in naturally. Ancient people may not have invented social media, but they absolutely invented the family obligation schedule. Now your attention returns to the Anunnaki, because modern ears often hear that word and immediately picture a single fixed idea. The reality is more complicated, and the complication is where the history becomes interesting. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian religious terms can be used differently across time and place, and that texts come from different cities, periods, and traditions. One interpretation is that the Anunnaki name functions as a flexible label for a group of significant gods, sometimes in an assembly, sometimes in relation to the underworld, sometimes in broader cosmic scenes. The evidence we do have points to other group terms, too, like the Igigi in some traditions, which can be described as heavenly gods in certain contexts. The categories overlap and shift, and scholars continue to debate how cleanly we should separate them. This is not a simple checklist. It is a living mythology with regional accents. Historians still argue whether the Anunnaki should be understood primarily as a formal, clearly defined group across Mesopotamian tradition, or whether the term shifts so much that it is better treated as a general label whose meaning depends on each specific text. You let that scholarly uncertainty sit gently, because it helps keep your footing. The past is not always crisp. Sometimes it is a set of overlapping circles. You move through the crowd and hear a hymn being recited, low and steady. The words are not for entertainment. They are functional, like a key turned in a lock. The people listening do not look bored. They look focused, as if the rhythm itself is doing something important inside them. Most historians agree that temples and priests play significant roles in maintaining ritual cycles, festivals, and offerings, which in turn support social order and institutional authority. A careful reading might suggest that religion provides a shared calendar and a shared explanation for why the city's work matters. When you labor on canals, store grain, or follow rules, you can frame it as participation in divine order rather than mere survival. Now the interesting part is how later imagination, both ancient and modern, reshapes these divine figures. What's broadly accepted is that later Mesopotamian cultures preserve, adapt, and reinterpret earlier Sumerian traditions. The evidence we do have points to continuities and changes, including shifts in the prominence of certain gods, changes in mythic emphasis, and evolving theological frameworks. One interpretation is that the Anunnaki become more symbolically charged as texts are copied and recontextualized, as empires rise and fall. The divine assembly can be used to express new political realities. A king might present himself as chosen by a high god. A city might emphasize its patron deity's authority. Myth becomes a language for legitimacy. You watch as a small offering is placed at the shrine, a pinch of grain, a splash of oil. The action is simple, and that simplicity is part of its power. It is repeatable. It is teachable. It is scalable. You could do it in a grand festival or in a quiet moment alone. The evidence we do have points to the strength of ritual, being its ability to fit many lives. A second light joke rises as you observe the offerings. You cannot help thinking that if any ancient god is truly omniscient, they have witnessed a lot of very improvised offerings. People are like, "Here is my devotion," and also, "Sorry, I only have half a date and a slightly dented jar." The gods, presumably, take it in stride. Now you step into a side chamber where temple officials handle practical matters. You see jars, seals, and tablets. The sacred and the administrative are neighbors here. Archaeology suggests that temples can act as economic centers, managing land, labor, and distribution. A careful reading might suggest that when myths speak of gods allotting destinies, they echo the human reality of institutions allotting rations, assigning work, and structuring obligations. The divine assembly becomes a poetic mirror of the council room. You look at a tablet with a list of names and deliveries. The marks are precise, the scribe's face is serious. This person is not doodling. This person is building reality, and that helps you understand why divine names matter. If your city's identity is tied to a god, then protecting the god's temple is protecting the city's legitimacy. The gods are in the bricks, in the storerooms, in the routines. Now, for the mystery portion, carefully framed. A popular rumor claims that the Anunnaki were not gods in a symbolic sense, but literal visitors, sometimes imagined as beings from the sky who engineered humanity or taught advanced knowledge. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence is thin for taking it as a historical conclusion. Many scholars interpret these stories as mythic language, not literal biography of extraterrestrials. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the rumor becomes less about aliens and more about a question that still fits the evidence. Why do humans describe origins using the language of beings who come from beyond the ordinary world? One interpretation is that the gods in such myths represent the arrival of new ideas, technologies, or social structures that feel so transformative they seem to come from somewhere else. Another cautious explanation could be that these stories preserve echoes of contact between different cultures, where newcomers appear powerful or strange, and memory turns them into divine figures over time. You feel the temptation of the rumor, because it is dramatic and clean. It offers a single secret key. But clean answers are not always honest. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We can confirm that the texts exist and that the names appear. We can confirm that myths describe divine assemblies and cosmic decisions. What we cannot confirm is a literal, modern sci-fi reading that the original authors did not necessarily intend. You step back into the open air. The night has deepened. A faint breeze moves through the courtyard and cools the sweat on your neck. You hear someone telling a small child a story, the child's voice popping up with questions. You can practically predict the questions, because children have always been the same. Why? Who? How? Are they still here? The adult answers patiently, smoothing the story into something the child can hold. A careful reading might suggest that gods in Sumer also serve as teaching tools. They explain why the world is ordered, why misfortune happens, why rules exist. They give personality to forces that otherwise feel abstract. Storm becomes a god. Wisdom becomes a god. Love becomes a god. Underworld becomes a god. When you personify forces, you can negotiate with them. You can bargain. You can plead. You can praise. It is psychologically practical, even if the theology is complex. A third light joke sneaks in as you watch the parent and child. You imagine the child asking, "If the gods decide everything, do I still have to go to bed?" And the parent replying, "Yes, especially because the gods are watching." Ancient parenting, timeless tactics. You walk toward a small gathering where someone recites a myth. The listeners are attentive. The speaker's voice is steady and measured, the way you would tell a story you have told many times. The myth describes a divine council. Decisions are made. Roles are assigned. Consequences ripple into the human world. The Anunnaki, in this telling, feel like a weighty presence, part of the architecture of fate. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian myths often portray gods as assemblies with deliberation, conflict, and resolution. One interpretation is that these narratives reflect human political realities, projecting them upward into the sky. Another interpretation is that they express a deep intuition. The world feels governed by forces beyond individual control. So you tell stories in which those forces have names and personalities. Now you notice the social function of the myth. It is not only entertainment. It is a way to reinforce shared values, shared fears, and shared expectations. The audience learns what is admired, what is punished, what is offered, what is forbidden. In that sense, myth is a quiet law book written in poetry. But let's stay balanced. The mainstream story remains strong. Sumerian religion is a complex system of gods, rituals, and institutions tied to city life. The interpreted layer suggests those gods reflect social realities and psychological needs. The imagined layer, used gently, invites you to picture the divine assembly as a cinematic court above the city. Lamps flickering below, stars glittering above, and decisions being made in a way that helps humans feel the world is not random. You stand under the sky and let the star field settle your mind. You think about the Anunnaki not as a single sensational answer, but as a name that carries many meanings across time. The evidence we do have points to ancient people using divine language to speak about order, authority, and the mysteries of existence. One interpretation is that when later readers search for a civilization that preceded all others, they sometimes project that desire onto the gods, treating divine ancestors as literal, historical founders. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. It is thin for literal claims that the Anunnaki were historical outsiders in the modern sense. But it is rich for understanding how humans build origin stories that feel bigger than any one city, bigger than any one king, bigger than one lifetime. And that is the real power of these names. They let the city feel connected to something vast, ancient, and meaningful, even when the ground under the bricks is always shifting. You take a slow breath and let the temple courtyard fade into calm. The lamps keep flickering. The prayers keep their gentle rhythm, and in that steady rhythm, you feel a simple truth that requires no exaggeration. The past is not only what happened, it is also how people remembered, explained, and ritualized what happened, turning survival into story, and story into the shape of a world. You step into a workshop district where the night air is busy with small, precise smells. Hot clay cooling, leather, oil, and the metallic tang that lingers around tools even when the forge is quiet. This part of the city feels like it never truly sleeps. Even if most people are resting, a few specialists keep working, because orders do not fill themselves, and deadlines apparently exist in every era. Most historians agree that early Mesopotamian cities include specialized crafts and organized production, supported by institutions and trade. Archaeology suggests that everyday objects, from pottery to tools to seals, can reveal how people lived, worked, and imagined their world. The evidence we do have points to craftsmen producing not only necessities, but also the small items that carry identity and authority. You walk past a potter's area and into a space where someone is carving a cylinder seal. A lamp sits close to the worker's hands, casting sharp shadows. The seal itself is small enough to fit in your palm, but the work demands intense focus. The carver uses a fine tool to cut tiny figures into stone. A scene so detailed it feels almost impossible to do without modern magnification. Yet there it is, slowly emerging. Archaeology suggests cylinder seals are used like signatures, rolled onto wet clay to mark containers, doors, and tablets. Most historians agree that seals play a major role in administration and social life, linking an individual or institution to an action. You watch the carver pause, rotate the stone, and continue. One interpretation is that seals are not only practical, but also psychological. They give people a sense of identity in a complex city. They say, "This belongs to me," or "This is authorized," or "This is protected." The carver finishes for the night and hands the seal to an apprentice, who rolls it on a scrap of clay. The image appears in a single smooth motion, a figure, an animal, a star-like symbol. It is art, authority, and narrative compressed into one gesture. You feel a small thrill, because this is the kind of artifact that travels across time almost intact, carrying a message you can still see. A careful reading might suggest that some motifs on seals hint at connections beyond the city. Certain animals, certain styles, certain arrangements of figures can suggest shared themes across regions. The evidence we do have points to trade networks moving goods and influences, especially because southern Mesopotamia lacks many raw materials like stone and metal. Where materials travel, ideas tend to hitch a ride. You move to a different store where a worker sorts small weights. They are shaped consistently, and the worker checks them with practiced hands. This is not casual. It is standardization. Archaeology suggests that early systems of measurement developed to support trade and administration. Most historians agree that such systems help institutions manage resources, taxes, and distribution. One interpretation is that standardized weights are a quiet revolution. They make trust portable. They allow strangers to trade. They also allow institutions to enforce obligations. Civilization is built on measurements. And yes, that includes the measurement of your patience. Now you reach a bench where someone is working with copper. The metal catches lamplight in a warm glow. The worker shapes a small tool, not ornate, just functional. Perhaps a chisel or a blade. The evidence we do have points to metal use increasing over time in Mesopotamia, with copper and later bronze becoming important. Archaeology suggests that metal often comes through trade, tying city life to distant sources of ore. One interpretation is that reliance on imported materials encourages long-distance relationships, whether cooperative or tense. You watch the worker test the edge, then nod with satisfaction. It is a small moment of pride, the same pride anyone feels when something turns out right. Your first light joke of the night slips in. Even in the ancient world, there is probably someone who makes a tool and immediately says, "Nobody touch this. It is perfect." And then someone else touches it, because that is how the universe stays balanced. You continue, and your eyes catch a cluster of odd items laid out on cloth. Amulets, small figurines, bits of stone with drilled holes. The vendor speaks softly to a customer, explaining what each item is good for. Protection, luck, health, safe travel. The evidence we do have points to personal religious practices existing alongside major temple rituals. Archaeology suggests small objects can reflect everyday beliefs and anxieties. One interpretation is that as cities grow complex, personal uncertainty grows too, and people seek portable comfort. You pick up a small figurine carefully. It is rough, not museum perfect, but it has a character. Its features are stylized, and its posture suggests attention, as if it is listening. You set it back down gently. The vendor smiles, as if you passed a test. Now, here is where the puzzles begin, because artifacts can look too clever to modern eyes. You might see a precise seal design or a standardized weight and feel tempted to imagine a sudden leap, as if someone handed people a blueprint for complexity. But the mainstream view is steadier. Most historians agree that technological and administrative systems develop through incremental changes, experiments, and social learning. The evidence we do have points to gradual sophistication rather than a single mysterious injection of knowledge. Still, the 30% mystery has a safe place here, because small puzzles are real. Archaeology suggests that some objects appear out of context, or their meanings remain unclear. A careful reading might suggest that our uncertainty sometimes comes from missing pieces, organic materials that did not survive, practices that were never written down, tools made of wood that vanished. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. You enter a narrow lane where a trader is unpacking goods from a basket. There are shells, beads, and a stone that looks out of place in this flat land. The trader holds it up proudly. It is smooth and hard, perhaps a stone from distant mountains. The evidence we do have points to long-distance trade bringing in stone, timber, and metals. One interpretation is that trade routes create cultural blending. Ideas about design, symbols, and even myths can travel with merchants. Because people talk while they bargain, they complain, they boast, they share stories. Merchants are basically ancient podcasts with worse audio quality. Historians still argue whether the most important driver of early Sumerian complexity is internal development within the floodplain, or whether external interactions and migrations play a larger role than we can easily trace in the archaeological record. You notice the traders' seals and the way they mark ownership. You notice the weights again. You notice how the entire system depends on tiny objects behaving consistently. Civilization, at this level, is fragile. A false weight can cause disputes. A forged seal can create chaos. A broken jar seal can ruin supplies. It is all held together by trust, enforcement, and shared symbols. You step into a small administrative corner where two officials examine a shipment. They roll a seal on clay to mark acceptance, then record quantities. The actions are calm, almost ceremonial. The evidence we do have points to administrative routines being standardized and widely used. One interpretation is that routine itself is a form of power. When an institution can make the world predictable, people become dependent on it. Now the vendor with the amulets calls your attention again. They point to a small symbol, then speak about warding off unseen troubles. That phrase catches you. Unseen troubles could mean illness, bad luck, jealousy, spirits, or simply the anxiety of living in a world where floods and politics can ruin you quickly. The evidence we do have points to humans everywhere creating protective practices. One interpretation is that in early cities, where strangers live close and competition is intense, people feel more exposed. They want protection that travels with them. A second light joke arrives as you imagine someone buying an amulet and saying, "This will definitely solve my problems," then immediately stepping into a puddle and sighing. Magical thinking is persistent, and reality keeps doing its little reality things. You continue into a quieter space where older tools and broken objects are piled for reuse. A cracked seal, a chipped blade, a broken weight. Even broken things have value here. The evidence we do have points to reuse and repair being normal, because raw materials can be scarce. Archaeology suggests that recycling is not a modern invention. One interpretation is that scarcity encourages ingenuity, and ingenuity becomes tradition. Now, the mystery lens again, clearly framed as theory. A fringe idea proposes that a few artifacts in Mesopotamia hint at knowledge handed down from an earlier, lost culture, perhaps one that existed before the rise of the known cities. This theory isn't widely accepted, and most scholars would prefer explanations grounded in trade, incremental development, and cultural exchange. Still, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it invites a softer question. Could some techniques and motifs be inherited from communities that left fewer traces, their names forgotten, even if their habits persisted? Archaeology suggests many early communities existed whose stories were never written down, especially before widespread writing. Their pottery breaks, their houses dissolve, their wooden tools vanish. What remains can be thin. In that thinness, it is easy to project a grand lost civilization. A more cautious explanation could be that the lost part is not a spectacular empire, but ordinary villages and networks that shaped later cultures quietly. You watch an apprentice practicing seal rolling on scrap clay. The motion is smooth now, but you can tell they have messed up plenty of times. The clay probably has a whole cemetery of bad rolls. Your third light joke slips in. Somewhere, there is an ancient pile of practice clay that looks like a museum of mistakes, and the apprentice definitely pretends it does not exist when visitors walk by. You pause at a stall selling beads. The beads are small, polished, and varied. Some are made from shell, some from stone. They are not just decoration. They signal status, belonging, maybe even protection. The evidence we do have points to personal adornment being meaningful in early societies. One interpretation is that in a dense city, where you meet many people, visible symbols help you navigate social space. They tell others who you are, or who you want to be. As you move deeper into the district, you notice the sounds again. Soft tapping, grinding stone, whispered bargaining. The city is not only grand temples and rulers, it is also these hands, these objects, these patterns of work repeated until they become a way of life. Most historians agree that craft specialization supports urban economies and institutional power. Archaeology suggests that workshops and production areas can be identified through debris, tools, and distribution patterns. You look at the ground and see tiny fragments of stone and clay, the leftover dust of creation. It makes you think about how history is often reconstructed from leftovers. You rarely find the whole object in place, perfectly explained. You find fragments, you find impressions, you find patterns. A careful reading might suggest that our picture of the past is always partial, and that partiality is where both humility and imagination belong. In the calm, what if, clearly imaginary. You picture a craftsperson learning a technique from an older mentor who learned it from an older mentor. And so on, until the chain disappears into time. What if somewhere in that chain there is a forgotten community whose name never made it into a tablet, but whose methods persisted? Not a secret super-civilization, just the quiet continuity of human learning. You take a slow breath and let the workshop district settle around you. The lamps glow, the tools rest, the seals wait to be rolled. The evidence we do have points to a thriving material culture in early Mesopotamian cities, with artifacts that reveal both practical organization and symbolic imagination. One interpretation is that these objects are the city's fingerprints, showing how it touched the world and how the world touched it back. And as you walk away through the narrow lane, you carry a simple, grounding feeling. Civilization is not only a story told by kings and priests, it is also a story told by weights, seals, beads, and tools, each one small enough to hold, each one strong enough to survive, each one hinting at hands you will never meet, and questions you cannot fully answer. You walk into a quieter space where the city's noise fades into a soft murmur, like someone turned the volume knob down to help you think. The air here smells like dry reeds and warmed clay, and the ground is smooth, swept clean in a way that suggests people care about order in this place. You realize you have wandered into a scribal school, or at least a training corner where knowledge is being rehearsed until it becomes instinct. A young trainee sits with a tablet on their lap, stylus poised, eyes narrowed in concentration. A teacher paces slowly, not rushing, but radiating the kind of calm authority that makes you straighten your posture even when you are not the one being graded. The evidence we do have points to scribal education existing as a specialized tradition, especially in later periods, and it is reasonable to interpret that early literacy and training also involve structured learning as writing becomes more complex. Most historians agree that writing and administration in Mesopotamia require skilled specialists, and those specialists are made through practice. On a tablet nearby, you see repeated signs, arranged in neat rows. It is the ancient version of doing handwriting drills. You almost want to whisper encouragement, but you resist, because the trainee already looks like they are one mistake away from staring into the middle distance. Your first light joke of the night slides in gently. You can practically hear the trainee thinking, "I chose this career to work with clay," and then realizing the clay has opinions and refuses to cooperate. Now, the focus here is not only writing as a tool, but language as identity. Most historians agree that Sumerian is a language isolate, meaning it is not clearly related to other known language families in the region. The evidence we do have points to Sumerian being recorded early in cuneiform, and later coexisting with Akkadian as languages and cultures interact. This matters because when a language stands alone, it can inspire a certain kind of mystery. The same way a solitary footprint in mud makes you look around and ask who left it. A careful reading might suggest that the uniqueness of Sumerian reflects layered populations, long settlement history, and cultural mixing in ways that are hard to map cleanly. Language can change through contact, migration, and social dominance. Sometimes a language persists in ritual and scholarship, even as another becomes dominant in daily speech. The evidence we do have points to Sumerian continuing as a learned literary language long after it stops being spoken as a native tongue. That fact alone tells you something about prestige and memory. People keep it because it carries authority, tradition, and sacred weight. You watch the teacher point to a sign, then to another, and speak softly. The trainee nods and presses wedges into clay, one after another, careful and slow. The action is meditative, like counting breaths. You notice how physical language is here. It is not floating sound. It is pressure, angle, spacing, rhythm. A word becomes a pattern of marks you can touch. Now you hear a conversation between two older scribes nearby. Not students, but professionals. They speak about how to translate certain terms, how to interpret a sign in a specific context. The evidence we do have points to scribes debating meaning, copying texts, and preserving older compositions. One interpretation is that scribal culture creates continuity across centuries, turning language into a bridge over time. Another interpretation, more cautious, is that scribal copying also introduces changes, because every act of copying is also an act of interpretation. Historians still argue whether the earliest development of writing in Mesopotamia should be understood mainly as a direct record of spoken language from the start, or as a more mixed system that begins as a counting notation and only gradually becomes a full representation of speech. That debate sits right at the center of why Sumer can feel like it preceded all others. If your culture is among the first to put language into durable marks, then your voice becomes one of the oldest voices that later people can still hear. That can create the illusion of absolute primacy, even when other cultures exist with rich lives that simply did not leave the same kind of written record. You step closer to a clay basket full of practiced tablets. Some are smudged, some are cracked, some are surprisingly neat. The trainee picks one up and grimaces at a mistake. The teacher does not scold harshly. They simply point, and the trainee tries again. This is how civilization becomes stable. Repetition until competence becomes habit. Now you shift into the bigger question of origins. Most historians agree that southern Mesopotamia develops within a larger Near Eastern context where farming villages and regional cultures exist long before cities become large and institutionally complex. The evidence we do have points to gradual change, with important developments happening across many communities over long periods. One interpretation is that calling any single group first can hide the fact that history is a braided river, not a single stream. Still, the Sumerian language being an isolate invites curiosity. Where did its speakers come from? How did they arrive in the floodplain? Did they migrate in? Or did the language develop locally out of older forms that we cannot trace? Archaeology can offer clues about settlement continuity and material culture, but language leaves a different kind of trail. A careful reading might suggest that the real answer is probably messy, movement and continuity mixed together, with interactions that did not leave a tidy label. You hear the teacher recite a short phrase, and the sound is unfamiliar to you. It has a cadence that feels ancient, crisp, and musical. The trainee repeats it, then writes, "This is more than paperwork. This is a culture rehearsing itself into permanence." Now, the mystery portion enters safely. A popular rumor claims that because Sumerian is an isolate and because Sumer appears early, it must come from a lost, older civilization that vanished elsewhere, leaving Sumer as a surviving outpost. This rumor is not widely accepted, and the evidence is thin for treating it as a firm conclusion. A more cautious explanation could be that language isolates can exist for many reasons, including the loss of related languages over time, limited evidence, and complex contact patterns that blur relationships. If we treat the rumor as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes an imaginative prompt. What if Sumerian speakers carried memories from an earlier homeland, or from earlier cultural phases, and those memories shaped how they described beginnings? That is cinematic, and it is not provable in a simple way, but it highlights a mainstream-friendly truth. Migrations and cultural mixing happen, and sometimes the written record catches only the later layers. You walk to a corner where a lexical list is being copied. It is a list of words, grouped by category: animals, plants, professions, objects. The evidence we do have points to such lists being a major part of scribal tradition. One interpretation is that making lists is a way to control complexity. If you can name things, you can manage them. If you can group them, you can teach them. If you can standardize them, you can administer them. It is the mind of a city turned into clay. Your second light joke arrives as you see the list of professions. You imagine professional list maker becoming its own profession, and you suspect at least one scribe would say, with total seriousness. It is a calling, while everyone else quietly wonders if the calling includes snacks. Now you notice something subtle. The teacher corrects not only the sign shapes, but also the spacing. The rhythm matters. The script is not only meaning, it is form. A careful reading might suggest that standardized writing helps standardize thinking. It encourages people to see the world in discrete units. This many jars, this many workers, this many days. That can strengthen administration. But it can also shape how people imagine time and identity. You step outside the school space into a lane where the night air is cooler. You hear distant water again, and you realize how much language and water are linked here. Water creates the agricultural base. Agriculture supports surplus. Surplus supports institutions. Institutions support scribes. Scribes support writing. Writing preserves language. Language preserves memory. Memory feeds identity. It is a chain, and each link depends on the others. Now you feel the phrase, preceded all others. Shift meaning. One interpretation is that the phrase does not literally mean Sumer came before every human culture. A more cautious explanation could be that it means Sumer is among the first to leave a large, readable archive of its voice. If first means first widely readable voice, then the claim becomes less boastful and more descriptive, but there is still a foggy edge that invites imagination. In the calm what if, clearly framed as possibility. You picture a group of people arriving in the floodplain, speaking a language no one else around them speaks, learning the canals, learning the soil, adapting quickly. They settle, they build, they trade, they argue, they marry. Their language blends with borrowed terms. Their children grow up fluent in the rhythms of the land. Over time, their words become the words of cities, and then, when writing arrives, their language becomes etched into clay, preserved beyond the ordinary cycle of forgetting. That is the moment when a culture can start feeling older than it is, because its voice survives while others fade. Historians still argue whether the cultural identity we call Sumerian is best understood as a single coherent group from the beginning, or as a later label applied to a region where multiple communities and traditions gradually coalesce into a recognizable civilization. You let that debate settle into the night air. It is a good debate, because it resists simple origin myths. It reminds you that civilizations are often made by blending, not by isolation. Now, for the mystery. One more cautious thread. A fringe idea proposes that certain ancient texts, especially those that speak about primeval times, hint at a very long prehistory of organized life that is hard to detect archaeologically. Perhaps because it was concentrated in places now underwater or erased by river shifts. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence is thin. Still, it points to a real archaeological challenge. Landscapes change, and the earliest sites can be buried deep or destroyed. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. You return to the quiet lane and listen to your own breathing. The city feels steady, and the night feels safe. The trainee's stylus tapping has faded behind you. But the idea remains. Language is a living artifact. It carries the shape of a people's mind. And in a place where writing takes hold early, language becomes one of the strongest bridges to the deep past. You take a final slow look at the school doorway, the lamplight spilling out onto the swept ground. The evidence we do have points to Sumerian writing and language creating one of humanity's earliest sustained literary and administrative traditions. One interpretation is that this tradition makes Sumer feel like the beginning, because beginnings are often defined by what survives. And in the soft, cinematic mist, you let yourself picture words pressed into clay like footprints in mud, not easily erased, guiding anyone who follows, quietly, into the oldest recorded conversations human beings ever kept. You walk into a room that feels cooler than the rest of the city, not because the night wind reaches here, but because the walls are thick and the air is still. A lamp burns low, and its light pools on a floor scattered with clay tablets like quiet, sleeping birds. The smell is dry dust, faint oil, and the earthy sweetness of baked clay. This is the kind of place where civilization talks to itself in whispers that last longer than any lifetime. Most historians agree that later Mesopotamian scribes copy and adapt older traditions, including Sumerian compositions. The evidence we do have points to archives and libraries where texts are organized, studied, and reproduced, sometimes for administration, sometimes for ritual, sometimes for education. You stand near a shelf of baskets and feel the strange intimacy of it. Human hands made these marks. Human hands decided which marks mattered enough to keep. A scribe sits cross-legged with a tablet on the lap. Stylus poised. Nearby, another tablet rests as a reference, the old text being copied into a new body. The scribe's eyes move back and forth in a steady rhythm, and you notice something subtle. Copying is not a perfectly mechanical act. Even when a scribe tries to be faithful, choices appear, spelling variants, sign preferences, clarifications, small additions that make a line smoother to read. A careful reading might suggest that every copied text is also a mild interpretation. Even if the scribe does not mean it to be, you hear a quiet conversation between two scribes, and the tone is gentle but firm, the way people speak when they care about precision. One asks whether a line should keep an older phrasing or adopt a newer one that fits better. The other replies that the older phrasing is how the ancestors said it. You can feel the tension between readability and reverence. Most historians agree that scribal traditions can preserve very old material while also reshaping it over time. The evidence we do have points to texts being edited, combined, and sometimes harmonized to suit new contexts. One interpretation is that this process can create the impression of a vanished golden age. Because the scribes present the past as coherent, grand, and authoritative, real history is messy, but curated history looks smooth. You move deeper into the room and see tablets arranged by type, hymns, myths, ritual instructions, lists, stories about gods, stories about kings. The tablet's surfaces catch lamplight and throw it back in tiny angles, like the clay is quietly blinking at you. You realize this is not only storage, it is a kind of memory palace, except the palace is made of baskets and patience. A young apprentice carries in a fresh tablet, still pale, and sets it down carefully. The apprentice looks nervous in the way people look when they're handling something important that could break, even if it is technically just clay. Your first light joke slips in. This apprentice has the exact energy of someone delivering a fragile cake across a crowded room, trying not to make eye contact with anyone who might say, "Oh, let me help," and then immediately drop it. Now, here is where the idea of a lost predecessor civilization gets its modern fuel. Later texts often speak about beginnings in grand, mythic language. They talk about early times, divine decisions, kingship descending, great floods, temples founded, cities blessed. What's broadly accepted is that these compositions are not written as modern history books. They are sacred narratives, cultural memory, and political language woven together. One interpretation is that when later scribes describe an earlier era as unusually orderly or unusually close to the gods, they are expressing a longing for stability in their own time. The past becomes a mirror for the present. If the present is uncertain, the past can be described as pure. If the present is politically fragmented, the past can be described as unified. If the present feels morally complicated, the past can be described as bright and clean. You approach a tablet that appears to be a mythic narrative. The scribe reading it murmurs under the breath, as if tasting the words. You catch names of gods and cities, phrases about fate and order. The language is elevated, stylized. It feels like poetry that also carries authority. You can understand how a listener might hear this and think, this must be how it really happened, because the tone is confident, but tone is not proof. The evidence we do have points to ancient authors using literary devices, symbolic numbers, and mythic frameworks. A more cautious explanation could be that the grandeur of the language is part of its function. It is meant to be repeated, performed, and believed in a devotional sense, not verified line by line like a modern report. Historians still argue whether many early Mesopotamian texts preserve direct memories of real prehistoric events, or whether they are primarily imaginative constructions that express social values and cosmic themes more than literal chronology. You let that debate settle like dust in lamplight. It is an honest uncertainty, and it matters because it shapes how you read the predecessor, dear. If you want a single hidden truth, you will force the texts into that shape. If you accept that texts can be sacred literature, political language, and a cultural memory at once, the picture becomes richer and less rigid. You notice something else. Some tablets have colophons or notes, little statements about the scribe, the school, the place, the act of copying. Not always, not everywhere, but enough to remind you that these are made objects. Archaeology suggests that scribal schools and professional scribes become a stable institution in many Mesopotamian periods. Most historians agree that the act of preservation itself becomes a cultural value. If you can claim you preserve the old words, you can claim authority. A careful reading might suggest that this creates a subtle incentive. Preserve texts that support your worldview. Copy what reinforces your temple's prestige. Emphasize myths that validate your city's patron deity. Highlight lists that place your dynasty in a favorable sequence. This does not require a villain twirling a mustache in a dark corner. It can be ordinary institutional behavior. Institutions tend to preserve what makes them feel legitimate. Your second light joke arrives as you watch a senior scribe check an apprentice's work. The senior scribe makes a small clicking sound with the tongue, the universal noise meaning not terrible, but not correct. If that sound could be written in cuneiform, it would probably be the most copied sign of all time. You drift toward another stack of tablets that seem to be old stories used in education. The apprentice scribes copy them to learn language and style. This is important because it means certain narratives survive, not only because they are sacred, but also because they are useful teaching tools. The evidence we do have points to educational copying being a major pathway for textual survival. One interpretation is that educational survival can distort the past. Texts that are beautiful, memorable, or stylistically rich get copied more, and therefore feel more ancient to later readers simply because they are more common. Meanwhile, many practical or local traditions might vanish because they are not part of the standardized curriculum. This is suggestive, not conclusive. But it raises the possibility that what survives is not a neutral sample of everything that existed. You look at a small tablet with a list of archaic words, maybe rare signs, maybe an older dialect form. The apprentice struggles, tongue pressed to the side of the mouth in concentration. You realize something quietly profound. A civilization can preserve a language it no longer speaks fluently, because the language has become a sacred tool. It becomes a gatekeeper. It becomes a badge of scholarship. It becomes a way of saying, we are connected to the deep past. Now, the mystery thread enters, clearly framed as theory. A popular rumor claims that later scribes intentionally encoded a secret message about a lost civilization that existed before the known cities, hiding it in unusual word choices, strange numbers, or mythic metaphors. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence is thin for treating it as a deliberate conspiracy. Still, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes an interesting way to think about how texts can carry layered meanings. One interpretation is that scribes may build deliberate ambiguity into sacred writing, not to hide aliens or lost continents, but to keep the text powerful. If a line can be read in more than one way, it can be used in more than one context. It can serve ritual, politics, and poetry at the same time. Ambiguity can be a feature, not a mistake. You imagine a scribe choosing a phrase that can mean both foundation and origin, both order and fate. You imagine the scribe smiling slightly, not because they are hiding a scandal, but because they enjoy the elegance of language. Your third light joke slips in. The ancient scribe version of "I know something you don't" is simply writing a line that makes sense in 3 different ways. Then, acting innocent when someone asks what it means, you walk to a tablet that contains a grand narrative about early times. It speaks of gods establishing institutions, of cities rising, of divine favor, of the world being set into order. Most historians agree that such stories provide cultural frameworks for understanding power and identity. The evidence we do have points to these narratives shaping how people interpret their own social structure. A careful reading might suggest that a civilization before can be a literary concept rather than a literal archaeological claim. It can be the imagined primeval era when the rules were written, when kingship and temples and law were first set in place. In that sense, the predecessor civilization is not necessarily another group of humans with different technology. It can be the divine world itself, the mythic layer that is said to establish the human layer. But you also notice that myths sometimes include hints of real human processes. A city being founded can echo actual migration and settlement. A divine decree can echo an institutional reform. A cosmic dispute can echo political conflict. This does not mean the myth is a coded diary of events. It means myth can reflect lived experience in symbolic form. You step outside the archive room briefly, into a corridor where the air is cooler. The night is quiet, and the sky is a deep bowl of stars. You take a slow breath, then return inside, letting the lamplight pull you back to the tablets. Now, another safe mystery thread. A fringe idea proposes that certain impossibly ancient claims in tradition point to a very long prehistory of organized life that left few traces. Perhaps because it was built with materials that did not endure, or because shifting rivers buried it. This theory isn't widely accepted, and it is hard to test directly. Still, archaeology suggests that landscapes can hide early sites deeply, and that preservation can be uneven. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. If we treat that as possibility rather than conclusion, it encourages a reasonable question. Could there be early settlements or complex networks we have not found? Whose existence would make ancient claims of deep antiquity feel less exaggerated? It is possible, and it is also possible that the claims are symbolic. Both can be true in different degrees. You return to the scribe's work area and watch the stylus press into clay. Each wedge is small, each wedge is deliberate. Each wedge is a choice that will survive in a way the scribe will not. The evidence we do have points to human beings building continuity through text. And that continuity creates a strong illusion of a single, deep-rooted origin. One interpretation is that later scribes create a kind of tunnel of memory. They pick certain lights to place along the tunnel, certain myths, certain lists, certain hymns, certain names. Anyone walking the tunnel sees those lights and thinks they are the whole landscape. But beyond the lights, there may be other paths that were never preserved, other communities that never got written down, other stories that did not fit the tunnel's shape, in the calm, imagined mist, clearly marked as imagination. You picture a scribe pausing late at night, stylus hovering, thinking about the weight of copying. The scribe knows that what gets copied will outlive them. The scribe chooses a phrasing that makes the past sound grand, because a grand past strengthens the present. The scribe is not lying in a simple sense. The scribe is crafting meaning, and meaning in a civilization of canals and temples and kings is its own kind of infrastructure. You let your shoulders relax. The archive room feels like a quiet ocean of clay, and the lamp flames look like tiny boats floating on it. Most historians agree that the survival of Mesopotamian texts shapes modern understanding of early civilization, because writing preserves voices that would otherwise vanish. One interpretation is that the predecessor civilization is partly a product of that preservation itself. The more ancient the archive feels, the more it tempts you to imagine something even older behind it. You watch the scribe finish a line and smooth the tablet's edge. The action is careful, almost tender. You realize the true riddle might not be hidden in a code. It might be hidden in selection, in what was chosen to be remembered, in what was left to dissolve back into mud. And in that quiet, you let the mystery remain what it should be for a bedtime journey. A puzzle, an open question, a soft fog at the edge of the lamplight. You do not need to force it into a single answer. You simply let the tablets be what they are, the city speaking through clay, and you let that calm, patient voice guide you deeper into sleep. You walk out into open air where the night feels wide and clean, like the sky has been freshly swept. The city's lamps are fewer here, and the darkness is softer, less busy. A canal runs nearby with a slow, steady whisper, and the sound is so consistent it could pass for a fan humming in the corner of your room. The air smells faintly of damp earth and reeds, and the breeze carries a hint of smoke from distant hearths that are settling down for the night. Most historians agree that the ruins and records of Sumer show extraordinary human innovation in city life, administration, monumental building, and early writing. The evidence we do have points to people organizing themselves in new ways, building institutions that can coordinate labor and resources at a scale that changes what community means. You feel that innovation under your feet even when you cannot see it, because the ground here is layered with the remains of decisions, habits, and hopes pressed into clay and brick. You walk along a low embankment and notice how the land is both generous and demanding. Crops can grow here because water and silt make the soil fertile. But maintaining that fertility takes constant work. Archaeology suggests that Mesopotamian life depends on managing water through canals, embankments, and careful seasonal planning. One interpretation is that the environment does not simply cause civilization, but it creates a set of pressures that reward cooperation and administration. A more cautious explanation could be that the rise of cities is a blend of factors: ecology, trade, institutions, and cultural traditions, none of them acting alone like a single magic switch. You pause near a small path that leads to an area of reeds. The reeds sway and hiss softly, and you see a reed boat tied loosely to a post. It rocks with the current, patient and calm. You watch it and realize how many big historical processes are built from small practical choices. Reeds are light and strong. Reed boats move goods. Moving goods supports trade. Trade supports specialization. Specialization supports institutions. Institutions support scribes. Scribes preserve memory. And memory is what later people will call the beginning. Now you arrive at the most delicate part of the night, the question hidden inside the title. What does it mean to say, the civilization that preceded all others, according to ancient Sumer? What's broadly accepted is that Sumer is among the earliest civilizations with extensive written records, but not the only early complex society in human history. The evidence we do have points to deep development across many regions, and it would be a mistake to treat Sumer as the only starting point for humanity's long story. Still, one interpretation is that Sumer feels like the first because it is one of the first to speak in a durable voice you can still hear today. Historians still argue whether Sumer's rise should be viewed mainly as a local culmination of long regional development, or as a process strongly shaped by migrations, interactions, and influences that are harder to trace in the archaeological record. You let that debate remain gently unresolved, because it belongs in the story like a quiet, open door. The past is not a single hallway with one exit. It is a building with many rooms, and some rooms are locked, and some rooms are buried, and some rooms were never built the way we imagine. Now, for the mystery portion, carefully framed as theory. A popular rumor claims that Sumerian traditions point to a hidden predecessor culture, sometimes described as a lost primeval society that taught key skills, set divine laws, or existed in an era before floods and political change. This rumor isn't widely accepted as literal history. The evidence is thin for treating it as a concrete archaeological civilization that can be named and dated. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a different kind of idea. The predecessor might be a memory layer, not a separate empire. One interpretation isn't that what came before in Sumerian thought can mean the mythic foundation era, the time when the world is described as being put into order by divine decisions. Another interpretation is that it can mean the earlier human phases of settlement that are difficult to see clearly because they are buried and because their voices were not written down. A more cautious explanation could be that the predecessor is not one thing. It could be both a poetic primeval time and a real pre-urban past. Blended together the way river channels blend in a marsh. You walk to a spot where the ground rises slightly, and you sit down. The bricks beneath you are warm from the day and slowly releasing heat into the night, the way a stone holds warmth under a blanket. You hear distant voices, but they are not sharp. They are soft, like murmurs that do not demand attention. A dog pads past and gives you a look that says, "You seem harmless," then continues on with important dog business. Your first light joke slips in. Even the ancient dogs have the same attitude as modern dogs, which is basically, "I will judge you silently and then forget you existed." You look up at the stars again. The sky is full, steady, and indifferent in a soothing way. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian societies pay close attention to the sky, building calendars and ritual timing over time. One interpretation is that the sky provides a model for order, and humans try to reflect that order in cities, laws, and temple schedules. It is possible that this desire for cosmic structure shapes how origin stories are told, if the heavens feel patterned. then perhaps the beginning must have been pattern too. Now you consider what remains, because remains are what we actually have. Clay tablets, broken pottery, foundations, canal traces, seals, weights, and the outlines of buildings that once held songs and arguments and meals. Archaeology suggests that much of what people used daily was organic and did not survive. Wood, textiles, reeds. A careful reading might suggest that what survives can distort what feels important. Because durable things like clay and stone are overrepresented, that is a possibility, not a certainty, but it is worth holding gently. Your second light joke arrives as you imagine a future historian studying your life based only on what survives in a landfill. They would conclude you worshipped cardboard boxes and plastic lids. And honestly, they would not be completely wrong. Now, the calm truth ladder stays with you. Documented ground. Sumer is a real early civilization with cities, writing, temples, and complex institutions. Interpreted ground. Sumerian texts and traditions frame origins in mythic language that may reflect social needs, prestige, and memory of older phases. Imagined mist, a cinematic sense that beneath the mud and reeds there might be older footprints, not proven, not pinned down, but felt in the way stories linger. You stand and walk along the canal edge again, following the sound of water. The canal is narrow here, and the surface reflects the stars in broken fragments. You reach down and let your fingers touch the water. It is cool. It slides over your skin and then it is gone. Moving on. The moment makes you think of how history moves. You can touch it briefly, but you cannot hold it still. Now, one more safe mystery lens. Softly. A fringe idea proposes that the strongest reason people keep imagining a predecessor civilization is because Sumer's own stories speak with such authority about beginnings that listeners assume there must be an even older chapter behind them. This theory isn't widely accepted as a specific factual claim, but as an interpretation of human psychology, it has weight. Humans are drawn to hidden layers. If there is a first city, we wonder about the camp that came before it. If there is a first written word, we wonder about the spoken story that existed before writing. If there is a first temple, we wonder about the shrine that existed before temples. And that is where the idea can become calming rather than sensational. The predecessor may not be a lost empire. The predecessor may be the ordinary, unrecorded human life that built the conditions for cities. The predecessor may be the countless small decisions, repeated across generations, that never made it into a tablet, but still shaped everything that did. You walk past a field boundary where a farmer's tools are stacked neatly. A simple hoe, a basket, a bundle of reeds. The scene is quiet and domestic. Most historians agree that agriculture supports city life through surplus production. One interpretation is that the true foundation of civilization is not the temple platform or the king list, but the everyday work that makes food appear reliably enough to support specialists. Without that, no scribes, no seals, no archives. Just hungry people and short memories. Historians still argue whether early states and institutions primarily emerged to manage resources and labor for survival, or whether they emerged through competition, prestige, and social hierarchy. With survival management following as a consequence, you let that debate rest in the background like a low lullaby. It is not a problem to solve tonight. It is a reminder that history has multiple engines. Now the wind shifts, and the reeds hiss again. The city is quieter now, with fewer footsteps, fewer voices. The lamps are dimmer, and the canal sounds more prominent. Your breathing slows without you forcing it. You think about how Suma might describe what came before, and you realize it is not a single claim. It is a layered feeling. It is the sense that order had to be established, that chaos had to be managed, that civilization is something humans build against the pull of water and time. It is possible that origin stories become dramatic because the daily work of maintaining order is exhausting. When you are tired, you want a beginning that feels meaningful. You want a story that says, "This matters." Now the wind down begins. Slow and soft, like you are easing a boat into still water. You sit again, this time closer to the reeds, and you let the canal sound become steady in your ears. The night air cools your forehead. Your shoulders loosen. You imagine the city settling into sleep, not in a sudden hush, but in gradual layers. One courtyard quieting, then another. One lamp going out, then another. Somewhere a last conversation fades into a murmur. Somewhere a last bowl is rinsed. Somewhere a last reed mat is pulled into place. Most historians agree that what we call Sumer is the result of human communities learning to coordinate in a challenging landscape, and the evidence we do have points to those communities leaving behind an unusually rich trail of writing and material culture. One interpretation is that this trail feels like a beginning because it is among the earliest trails we can follow with clarity and in the calm, imagined mist. You allow the oldest possible image, purely as a gentle what-if. A person standing at the edge of water long before any city walls, listening to reeds whisper, deciding to shape mud into brick, brick into a room, room into a home, and home into a place that can be remembered. Your mind does not need to chase the perfect answer. It can simply rest with the feeling that history is both solid and mysterious. Solid where tablets and ruins remain, mysterious where water and time have blurred the lines. You are not proving anything tonight. You are following clues, then letting the clues fade into calm. The canal keeps whispering. The reeds keep swaying. The stars keep their patient positions. You let your eyelids grow heavy, and you imagine the clay tablets cooling in their baskets, the marks on them safe in the dark. You let the idea of before become less like a threat and more like a soft horizon, a place your thoughts can drift without needing to arrive. Your breathing slows again, deeper, smoother, like the whole floodplain is breathing with you. The city is just a silhouette now, gentle and quiet. The water is the lullaby. The night is the blanket. And the oldest story is simply this: humans trying, again and again, to remember. End of script. Sweet dreams.